And it's time now for BBC Ask This, where we take your questions on the biggest stories. Today, of course, that is the question of tackling the Prime Minister's decision to suspend Parliament and all the questions that has given rise to. I'm joined by Dr. Catherine Haddon, a senior fellow at the Institute for Government, who's going to help us work our way through these. Thank you very much for coming along, Dr. Haddon. And let's begin with a question from Anthony Begg, who asks, MPs annually vote to recess during the conference season, which, as we all know, is coming up. So does this not mean the proroguing is actually only slightly longer than usual?
Yeah, it's the slightly longer is one of the sort of key issues to all of this. It's absolutely true. They do normally go away for around 3 weeks during this period to go off to the party conferences. But there's some key differences. The first one is that actually recess is very different from proroguing. In recess, Parliament can still meet. There's still activities that go on in Parliament. Proroguing is very different. There will be no activity in either chamber, so not in the House of Lords either. Secondly, it also means that there's an end to this session. So anything that MPs do in the next couple of weeks in terms of legislation, they've got to get finished, because they can't then carry on with the same stuff when Parliament comes back.
It can't be carried over, in other words.
It can't be carried over. So either, if they're trying to get in a new piece of legislation to stop the government doing no deal, they have to either do it in the next 2 weeks, or they have to do the whole thing again when Parliament returns. It also means that the time is actually much shorter for two reasons. I mean, one is that this is now going to be about 4.5, possibly 5 weeks of a break rather than 3 weeks. It didn't need to be that long. Given we've got very few parliamentary sitting days remaining, that's going to eat up a lot of time. But also it means that when Parliament comes back after that, they have a Queen's speech. And that means 4 or 5 days of debates followed by votes before they can get back to anything to do with Brexit. Though obviously you can expect the Queen's speech to be all about Brexit as well. So that means they'll only have about 6 parliamentary days before the 31st of October.
And the length of the proroguing is at the heart of one of the legal challenges, just to mention, as we heard from Gina Miller, the campaigner, the anti-Brexit campaigner earlier. She is taking forward in her legal challenge the question of what is the intention behind the proroguing. Let's move on to a question now from Melvin Smith, who asks, can the Leader of the Opposition ask the Speaker for an emergency debate on Brexit?
Yes, and any MP can, and we expect that to happen next week when they come back. And what is probably going to happen is that MPs are going to try and use that emergency debate to try and get control of parliamentary agenda back, you know, the same that they were doing back in April, in order to bring in legislation. Now, this would be a big change in how these kind of emergency debates are used, but the Speaker has indicated previously that he thinks that there is scope for more to be done using this particular mechanism. So we will see next week whether or not they can manage to do that.
Just let me bring in a little supplementary to that. What would the role of the House of Lords be then? Because some people looking at the timetable have said, oh, any debate could be filibustered, extended in the House of Lords, meaning that there would be a lack of time to actually vote on it.
Absolutely, and this is crucial. So if, when they come back next week, they have an emergency debate, they then can only bring in some legislation, take control of the order paper the next day. It's a question of how rapidly that can get through the Commons, but after that it's got to go to the House of Lords, and the House of Lords has slightly different rules about how time is proceeded with and who controls it. So it means that some peers will be able to try and stall for time. And they don't have a lot of time between next week and the following week. We still don't know when Parliament's going to break for this prorogation. It might not be till the following Thursday, but it could be, you know, they might be trying to be sooner. But it means that you've got a short amount of time and you've got to get this through both houses for it to become law.
OK. The next question is from Simon Pickhaver, who asks, could the Speaker of the House thwart the intentions of the government? And we heard Jacob Rees-Mogg saying that what John Bercow had said yesterday in response to all of this, calling it a constitutional outrage. Jacob Rees-Mogg said that that comment was the most unconstitutional thing that had happened all day.
Yes, well, the one thing that's not new in any of this is a battle between the Speaker and the government. The Speaker's role is to promote and to facilitate debate, to champion the role of backbench MPs and to make sure that the House has its say. That's going to be his argument in all of this. But he's been quite vocal and also quite active in trying to make sure that Parliament has its says, and that often has led him into conflict with the government. He's probably going to do that again, as I mentioned before, this emergency debate, what amendments he chooses for that, how he governs that whole process. That's going to be a really crucial role that he plays. In terms of proroguing itself, there's not so much that he can do there. That is something that is in the gift of the government and so is out of his hands.
Andy Kirkland asks a question about the petition that we've been mentioning today, the petition against suspending Parliament, which has achieved more than 1 million signatures. Perhaps we can get a check actually on the precise number. Can the government simply ignore the issue, asks Andy Kirkland.
This is a tricky one because these petitions, they will lead to some kind of House of Commons debate about it or Westminster Hall debate about it and about the issue. But no, it doesn't bind the government into any kind of action. It will have political force and it will help embolden those who, support the petition. But in terms of forcing the government's hand, no, it won't be able to do that.
That petition at nearly 1.4 million signatures at the moment, incidentally. Phil Fearon next asks, why has the amendment to the Northern Ireland Executive Formation Bill intended to prevent suspension of Parliament failed to block this? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, this is crucial because the reason for those clauses in that bill were to try and make sure that Parliament couldn't be prorogued during this period. But crucially, they were about stopping Parliament being prorogued through the whole of this period up until the 31st. What they've done is create a window, and the government seem to have chosen that window to then suspend Parliament in this way. So Parliament does have to, there has to be a report on the 9th of September, and that has to be debated. After that, it's then on the 9th of October, I think, is the next time they have to report. And then 5 days after that is when government have to hold some kind of debate on it. And that's the 14th of October, which is why we think that date has been chosen. So there's that gap, and that's the one that the government has chosen to fit in this prorogation period.
OK. Susan Graham asks, does it set a precedent for government to suspend Parliament each and every time they fear Parliament might oppose their will?
I mean, this is the nub of the issue of all of it, and what everyone's quite worried about is what it means in terms of how the government is viewing the role of Parliament during this whole period and what kind of precedent that says. If you start to ignore fundamental constitutional conventions, principles of how our democracy ought to work,
and who has supremacy?
And who has supremacy? What precedent does that set for the future? Does it open a can of worms where governments are going to continue to try to do this in the future? And it's not just this one we're talking about. There's also a lot of talk about Fixed Term Parliaments Act. If there's a vote of no confidence, will the government resign or not? So there's some fundamental issues in our constitution that we seem to be sort of either sidestepping or potentially ignoring. And that's very worrying and very damaging potentially for the long-term future of our constitution.
And another question, this time from Colin Godfrey, who asks, what happens if the EU has a change of heart during the shutdown?
Well, the government continues in office. So if the EU come back and say that actually we can see a way through a deal, there's some change to the backstop, something that Boris Johnson wants to get, the government can still go away and negotiate that during this prorogation period. But crucially, they're also cutting the amount of time that they would have in Parliament when it returns. So they would also only have a very few number of sitting days in order to bring through any kind of legislation if they wanted to get it all done and dusted by the 31st of October. That seems highly unlikely that they'd have the time to do that.
We sometimes ask who's going to blink first, but as you say, the time in which to do that is getting squeezed on all sides.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what this move may have done is harden the resolve of those who are opposed to no deal and made them want to act sooner. So it may be that therefore we see much more action next week than we would have done.
OK, Dr. Catherine Haddon, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government, thank you so much for coming along to answer those questions and for your expertise.